Hello, everybody. As we crawl towards the end of 2025, we're getting some old friends of the show back on to talk about 2025 and try to imagine what's going to happen in 2026. Back in the summer, The Economist ran an interesting piece entitled The New World Disorder. And I think they perhaps might have stolen that phrase from my old friend Jason Pack, the host of the excellent Disorder podcast. Jason, congratulations on being appropriated by The Economist. You must have felt pretty good about that one.
I had earlier been appropriated by Thomas Friedman and a few other think tanks who all write about the coming disorder.
Yeah, and actually another person who borrowed your term is Mike McFaul, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia. He was on my show recently. He has a new book out called Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder. So, Jason, was 2025 Exhibit A in our new global disorder? What surprised you and what didn't about the year that is coming to a close?
Well, you're getting right to it. I feel like, sadly, many of my predictions came true, which is that rather than Trump's disordering the globe, leading to a coalition of orderers pushing back against him, that coalition didn't really materialize. How do I mean? When he haphazardly announced that there would be tariffs on Liberation Day, April 2nd, 2025, you could have imagined all the Europeans coming together and then working with allies like Japan and South Korea and elsewhere to have a coalition against the Trump tariffs. That didn't happen because the orderers have not coherently worked together against the disorderer. You could have imagined that with all of Trump's threats to NATO, the Europeans would truly step up and would, for example, completely confiscate the frozen Russian assets, mostly held in Belgium, and use them to fund Ukraine. But what do you know? They haven't confiscated those assets. They're just using the interest on the asset payments to fund Ukraine. So I had predicted that disorderers would reign and that the orderers would not really work together. The only counterbalance or countervailing example is, I think, Mark Carney. The election of Mark Carney and the way in which the Canadian population coalesced around him is an example of the disorderers pushing too far and then political dynamics in another country all of a sudden being transcended and a new discourse emerging. So it's mostly a negative picture in Britain and Europe, but with some slight positives in Canada and elsewhere.
I want to come to Carney in a minute, Jason, but you and I have talked about this in the past. Aren't you just nostalgic for another age and that your use of this word disorder is the language of a conservative? You're simply not happy with the world. The new world might not be a particularly attractive world, but it's a reality, and you want to go back to maybe you talked about Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England now, I think, who is the Prime Minister of Canada, a very traditional 20th century kind of guy.
No, you're onto something for sure. And I'm the first one to admit I have a degree of social conservatism, whether it comes to my stances against gay marriage. I don't believe in there being something called transgender. But
you're against gay marriage?
Oh, yeah. As are all of my homosexual cousins and stuff. They've told me back in the 1990s when they first came out as gay, we're against gay marriage because if you do gay marriage, it's just going to offend all of the evangelicals in the center of the country and we're going to lose our freedoms. And little did I know how correct my Manhattan gay cousins were, because they were right. It did offend
the you on the show with John Roush, another old friend of the show. I think he would strongly disagree. I don't want to turn this into a gay marriage conversation.
Well, you said, and my point is, I own my social conservatism. I have always had certain views, which is that if we poke the bear, and gay marriage and trans issues are things about poking the bear has reemerged, right? So we have allowed the discourse to go too far. And my fears about Mamdani and Zach Polanski is that they're going way, way, way too far. But that's not what I mean when I talk about order versus disorder. I can be a social conservative, but what I'm longing for is just technocracy, whereby we don't have a political input into the Fed's decision to raise interest rates, where people don't tempt the bond markets. They read the data before they choose something about tariffs or something about interest rate hikes. In other words, I long for a technocracy that may never have existed even in the 20th century. But I believe that we need to exist rather than this populism, which is people sticking their finger out and saying, oh, it's popular to say that we're going to attack small boats or that we want to build this wall, not understanding the economic implications of that. I'm pro technocracy.
But isn't the world that you describe as disordered, Jason, divided? On the one hand, I acknowledge that there's a populism certainly in Moscow and a milder one perhaps in Washington, D.C., but in the EU, in the UK where you live, and certainly in China, the forces of technocracy are still dominant.
I don't see it that way. Kiir has not been able to accomplish much of his agenda because he's terrified by.
You're talking about Starmer, the current British Prime Minister.
Correct. Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, despite having an 80-seat majority that he won on July 4th, 2024, has accomplished very little. His popularity has plummeted because on the right, he's attacked from the Tory media and then from the further right, from Reform, the party led by Nigel Farage, which wants to make everything into a culture war issue and make it about migration. And then on the left, whether it's Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party, or others who simply oppose normal technocratic ways to get the economy moving and to raise more revenue. So he's really between a rock and a hard place. And he's, like Macron, an embattled centrist who can't really use technocrats properly. I would say that he and Macron showcase my argument, which is that disorder is reigning because the orderers are not able to be like, we need to have this kind of tax and build these roads and get HS2 to work. And we have to see that the railroads and the healthcare things are not happening because there are too many populist pressures.
Jason, what about the Chinese model? I take your point on Starmer, and maybe we can talk about the Farage model versus maybe the Mark Carney model later. But there was a very good book published this year by Dan Wong, a Canadian-based Canadian-Chinese writer, which described the Chinese model, for better or worse, as an engineering state and the American one as the lawyer state. Whatever one thinks of China, it is an engineering state, a top-down state, a highly ordered state. So is China your best hope as a nostalgist for order?
No, again, I don't think that that's fair. Yes, the Chinese have some decent economists and engineers, but they're also repressing the Uyghurs. They're monitoring their population.
But Jason, sorry to jump in here. I wasn't asking about repression. You can be a repressive.
No, but that's not orderly. They take 1 million people and dislocate them from their homes for no reason. And yes, you could say there's something orderly about a social credit score, but it is based on, insane violations of privacy and algorithms. That's not order. That's just a kind of an inversion of what makes society function. Their economy is not doing well. They have that real estate bubble. They have their oversupply crisis. They're not able to make ordered decisions for the same reason that almost all autocracies can't. Every person wants to tell the boss, we produce more solar panels, boss. We're the best. No, don't look at these data. We succeeded. Widget production has increased, which is why each region competes to oversupply in terms of solar panels and rare earths and other things without allowing a real market economy to exist there. That's not order.
So are you suggesting then in your analysis of order, Jason, that the best order is a liberal democratic one? That's what ensures order, and that the Chinese model of authoritarianism, some people might even say Xi's totalitarianism, is by definition disordered ultimately?
It is disordered because he wants the West to not gang up against him. So he has to disorder the EU and disorder the relationship between North America and Europe so they don't gang up against China. They're happy for the Ukraine war, as well as various conflicts in the Middle East, to continue indefinitely, because that prevents the democratic world from trying to democratize China. So yes, he wants disorder abroad, and he needs a certain modicum of disorder, such as the conflict with Taiwan, to rally nationalism internally to stay in power. What I want is a world which is moving towards progress, working together on, for example, the melting of the Arctic ice, working together on carbon emissions, working together to regulate AI. The Chinese are so nationalist, Andrew, as you know better than I do, sitting in Silicon Valley. They would rather an all-out race for AI supremacy than working together to have AI safeguards. That's not order.
Maybe another show. Jason, for me, looking at 2025, I'm not suggesting it was necessarily the most ordered of years, but it seems as if in late December 2025, the world is slightly more ordered, a nuance of more order than it was at the beginning of the year. We have the beginnings of a tentative peace in Ukraine.
Do we?
There's no, let me finish.
Sorry.
There's no longer all-out slaughter or war in Gaza. Am I wrong?
Gaza is a qualified success. The 20 hostages were returned, and Palestinian babies are getting aid and not being blown up indiscriminately for the most part. So that one I'll give you. And the point is, as someone who hates Trump as much as me, it's giving a lot for me to say Trump achieved something there that probably Harris would not have been able to. But Ukraine, he's switching his position every few weeks.
Who?
He's trying
Trump
to
or
sell out our
Putin
allies.
or Zelensky?
Trump is selling out his allies. He's selling out the Europeans and Zelensky's. There's no order to that. I'm missing you.
Well, there's lots of talk. The Financial Times, this will come out a bit later, has a headline today about the EU race to bypass Orban on Russian assets before the summit. Isn't this just a structural recalibration, Jason, as America begins to withdraw from Europe and the Europeans are more responsible for their own security? There's nothing disordered about that.
It's extremely disordered. And I'll situate this relative to the tariffs. You're right that the Chinese overvalued their currency. And you're right that they did unfair trade practices and intellectual property theft. So Trump was courageous to call out what much of the liberal elite, Democrats and Republicans, were not willing to call out. But he didn't have an ordered solution. He raised tariffs, then he lowered them. He put tariffs on other countries rather than just China. Then he took those tariffs off. That's not order. He didn't have one peace plan for Ukraine that made any sense. Oh, we'll take away the intelligence sharing. Now we'll give it back. I'll have a summit in Alaska, but now I'll put pressure on Russia. I'll be angry at the Russians, but now I'm angry at Zelensky. There's been no peace plan. There's absolutely no coherent vision. Is it correct to get the Europeans to spend more money on defense? Absolutely. Is it correct to ask Europe to build anti-aircraft capabilities where they have relied on American ones previously? Absolutely. But go about that in an orderly way. Let the generals make policy. Don't do that from the White House, ping-ponging back and forth. And let the economists make our policy to recalibrate U.S. exports in the position of the dollar vis-a-vis the renminbi. Don't just do it with a megaphone and switch back and forth. That is disorder.
I'm no bigger fan of Donald Trump than you are, but isn't that just his style? He says one thing one day, wakes up, says something else the next day. He's always been like this, and he always will be like this. And I'm not entirely sure that anyone around the world takes him that seriously, because it's self-evident that whatever he says one day, the next day he might revert.
Yeah, but it's not great if you're someone who on April 2 is sitting in a pension fund and it loses 15% of its value. It's not really great if you're someone in the Donbass whose aunt gets blown up because they decided as a negotiating tactic to take away the intelligence sharing with the Ukrainians that day, and there was no Arrow or THAAD missile to hit the Russian drone that kills your aunt. That's just not the way to do economics or diplomacy. So I need to push back and say, Trump is correct in many of the problems that he points to. But the disorder is that in terms of getting to solutions, he goes back and forth and there's no coherent through line because he doesn't trust experts or the institutions to make those solutions. And we can litigate this infinitely. And listeners to my or Andrew's Keenan show will have heard he and I discuss this previously. I don't think it's useful to go in too many circles. Other than that, I acknowledge some of the cultural and structural issues that Trump points out have been wrong in the American economy, in Western dealing with migration, and even in Ukraine and in the Israel-Palestine issues, but then have a concrete, by the book, expert, tried and tested way of getting there, rather than a haphazard one step forward, 9 steps laterally, and 2 steps backward while I enrich Jared and Witkoff while we're getting to that solution. That's not order.
You make, Jason, Mark Carney your man of the year for 2025. But is there a case to make Putin the man of the year in the sense that his version of disorder is clearly winning? It's winning in Ukraine. It's winning with Trump. It may ultimately even win with a new Iron Curtain in Europe. What kind of year has 2025, in your view, been for Vladimir Putin?
That's a great question. I think in many ways you're right. Putin has survived, and as a survivor, he's doing well. He has seen the popularity ratings of most centrist European leaders like Starmer and Macron plummet, and the rise of his cronies in the neo-populist movements like the AfD or the National Rally in France rise. But there are many structural factors that are working against Putin. Crude prices are down, Andrew, and Russia is making less money from oil exports because the global economy isn't doing well. And beyond that, this was the year that he lost control over Syria, and his ability to play politics in the Middle East because of the Israel-Palestine thing going on forever has been hurt. And you may say that the Indians and the Chinese have one-upped him and have turned that relationship, whereby India and China, because of the oil price cap and their importance in buying discounted Russian crude, now have greater and greater leverage on him. So structurally, he's in a much weaker position than he was previously, although I will give it to you that politically he's a great survivor.
It's hard, obviously, to predict. I'm not asking you to predict, certainly in the last 2 weeks of December, what's going to happen with Ukraine. But can one argue, Jason, that in 2026, some sort of peace in Ukraine is relatively inevitable? I mean, got to be careful with that word, predicting the future. But do all the parties, both in Kiev and Moscow and Washington and even Beijing, does everybody now want some sort of peace?
Well, I'm not being falsely modest here when I say I don't know what's going to happen at all. And I couldn't make a prediction because I simply don't have one. I don't think that the Ukrainian people want a peace that entails giving up territory that they currently hold. They may be able to have their arms twisted to make the line of contact in Donbass, Donetsk, Kherson, and elsewhere into a quote unquote peace line. I don't want to twist their arms to do that. I think they should get back territory rather than give up territory. And I don't know if that's going to happen. I am worried that Trump is trying to sell them down the river, and that in so doing, he will only allow Putin to stay in power and Putin to destabilize other Eastern European.
I guess there's two readings of if there is a peace. I take your point, no one can predict. But if there is some sort of peace, some Europeans will say, well, we're next, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, wherever, Finland. The other argument is he got a little bit of what he wanted. We're going to build a new Iron Curtain. We're going to establish NATO forces in the Baltics and Poland and elsewhere. And basically, we're back in 1945 or 1948. Which of those arguments do you think is more convincing?
I think it's somewhere in between the two. It could be a way to draw a line under things if there was a robust American commitment to giving security guarantees to the rest of the Ukrainian state. That would be great. If the war could end with Ukraine becoming an EU and NATO member, then it's a win and then it's over. Great. Then even give them a few villages in Donbass. Great. But that's not what's being discussed. What's being discussed is a kind of disarming of Ukraine where they would have a cap on their army and there would be no American security guarantees. That's not a situation I want to see, and that's not peace. The historical analogy for that is like what happened in the Sudetenland, where at the Munich conference, Neville Chamberlain and Hitler spoke, and Chamberlain comes back to England waving a piece of paper. There'll be peace in our time. I have a guarantee that if we, don't come to the aid of Czechoslovakia and Hitler annexes the Sudetenland where there were German speakers, that then he would stop there. Well, we both know what happened. So I wouldn't allow something that is actually appeasement to be called peace. I have no idea if that's going to happen in 2026, but I think Trump would like to see it happen, and it's disorderly. So I would hope that the rest of the world could get their act together to propose an ordered solution. I think it's really important to criticize the Europeans here. While things were going on in Gaza, and you could say, well, Trump's peace plan was too kind to Netanyahu, or crazy talk about a pardon for Netanyahu is not appropriate for an American leader. I didn't see Starmer, Macron, initially Schultz, and now Merz come up with a European peace plan. Why didn't they have a conference in London or Berlin where the EU proposed hostage swaps and prisoner swaps? It didn't happen. Where is the EU proposing its peace plan and offering what it would give to Putin? Because the EU could fill the vacuum, but they're just not able to speak with one voice. And that's because of the disorder whereby the Spanish and the Germans are on opposite sides of approaches both to Ukraine and to Israel Gaza. It's crazy.
Well, it's not crazy in the sense that they have different interests. What could they learn then from Mark Carney, your man of the year for 2025? What could the Spanish and the Germans and the EU and even the UK, what is there a model there that can be emulated in terms of our disordered age?
I think there is. I'm going to draw out 3 lessons here. Now, when I say that Carney should be the man of 2025, it's the movement that led to him as much as it is Carney himself, right? So here are my 3 lessons. Let's start with the first one. Do not succumb to bullies. Many European leaders raced to Washington in the wake of the tariffs. Oh no, I want to cut a deal. Can we go back to 10% instead of 15% tariffs? Oh, we want an exclusion for our cars. And one by one, they caved to Trump, just as the Japanese and South Koreans did. We promise $1 billion of investments in America. We promise $500 billion of investments. Just take the tariffs off. When if they had worked together, they could have had a unified bloc. That's not what Carney did. Carney, both in Mar-a-Lago and in the Oval Office, stood up to Trump and said, great, you want to punish us? Punish us. You want to do this? We're running an ad in America of Ronald Reagan saying why tariffs don't make economic sense. And when Trump got really pissed off about that because he was afraid that it would make him look bad while the Supreme Court case is going on, he even froze the negotiations with Canada because Carney was getting under his skin. Carney was pushing back. He wasn't allowing himself to be bullied. So that's the first lesson. The Europeans and Japanese and others can stand up to Trump. You know, when you push back on a bully, he backs off. Lesson 1. Lesson 2 is unify the orderers. Canada has a political system like Westminster, and it's quasi-multi-party. They have a Liberal Party, they have a Conservative Party, they have Quebecois this, they have an Albertan separatist movement. Carney comes in and he unites lots of people who were going to vote for Poilievre and people who hated Trudeau with people who liked Trudeau under the flag of we are Canada. We are not the 51st state. We stand by Canada. And this has been amazing culturally. Here's a statistic for you. Canada was the greatest recipient of American exports of wine, particularly Californian wine, over the last 30 years. Sales of Californian wine, as well as other American wines to Canada, are down 70% since Trump made his joke about being the 51st state. Restaurants which are still serving wines from Napa and Sonoma are frequently boycotted in Canada as it is seen as not patriotic. Sales of other American products are tremendously down. The Canadian people, from conservative to liberal to green, have rallied and said, we are not going to allow us to be bullied into losing jobs and losing our economy. And this issue of solidarity is really, really important because there are threats to Europe, but also to Japan and South Korea. And you need to transcend traditional party boundaries. And I believe that Carney in his person allows that movement to happen. He speaks for an elbows up Canadianism. And I'm not Canadian, but I would be really proud to be Canadian, given how gracefully he's handled that. Lesson number 3, I don't want to prattle on too much about my mega orderer-in-chief, Mark Carney. Lesson number 3 is technocracy. He didn't freak out when there was pain to the Canadian economy, because he could have been like, oh my God, we need to do tons of deficit spending. Oh my God, we need to do reorientation of our entire economic model. He didn't do that. He's gradually getting Canada part of the European Space Agency, gradually using CANDO, and that's the name of the Canadian nuclear, to get deals in the Emirates and China and elsewhere, and gradually going to all of the partners from Europe to the Middle East to boost the Canadian economy in a technocratic way, not freaking out in a populist way that it needs to be done immediately. And I think that those are 3 lessons that mega orderers the world over can learn from Carney. Is he the best communicator ever? No, but he's a reasonable guy, and he's someone that I would have faith in if I was a Canadian.
Well, there you have it. The man of the year, at least for Jason Pack, Mark Carney. I know you're ambivalent about making predictions, Jason, about the future. What was it? Yogi Berra said something very funny about that, suggesting that predictions are particularly hard, particularly about the future. But if there is an antithesis of Carney, it's a certain Jeffrey Epstein, who's no longer around. I know you've got some ideas about Epstein being the man, so to speak, of 2026. I know you've also got an upcoming piece in the Spectator on this that may even be out by the time this interview is broadcast. Why is Epstein important for 2026? I thought he was dead.
Yeah, I wish that the conspiracy theories around him were dead. I think that they're only going to get worse. I don't want to jinx the piece in the Spectator because the reality is editors might pull these things. So just as I can't predict the future, I can't even predict that the piece will come out. I think that there is a cover-up of certain information about Epstein. And as someone who spent most of my life fighting against conspiratorial and specifically anti-Semitic conspiratorial themes, we need to own as centrists when there are things out there in the media and in real life which are actual elite stitch-ups. Because when there are degrees of conspiracies, you can't just sweep it under the rug, because the more that we in the mainstream and in the elites attempt to say it was just a sex scandal, the more that people on the extreme right, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, or on the extreme left, like Mamdani and Zach Polanski here in the UK, are going to gain in power. Because
can I just jump in? I mean, are you suggesting that Mamdani or Polanski in the UK are sort of somehow equivalent to Marjorie Taylor Greene, the same irrational extremism?
I'm not saying they're equivalent. No, I'm merely saying that they are non-establishment voices that are aided by the more there is a cover-up about Epstein. The more that this cover-up continues, whether it's about Epstein's meetings with Ehud Barak, the Israeli former prime minister, or his connections to people like Larry Summers and Bill Clinton, or other connections, which are not just about the sex scandal, but are about him as a power broker who set up meetings with Putin. People are not talking about the fact that Epstein was a fixer who set up meetings with Putin. And this is going to come out in greater detail when the Epstein files are released due to the Epstein Accountability Act. We in the media and in centrism need to explain how unaccountable, unelected fixers, of which Epstein is an example, were able to cater to global elites and the financier class and arrange meetings and inside dealings for them. I mean, this has been known that power has accrued.
But that's the nature of things, Jason, isn't it? I mean, always powerful people introduce one powerful person to another powerful person. In that sense, Jeffrey Epstein's no different from any other fixer in world history. What he's different from is that he was a pedophile too.
There is a slight difference, which is that since Reaganism and Thatcherism in the 1980s, elites have had relatively more power and have become increasingly more multinational. There were always elites in the most powerful country in the world, whether it was Britain or the US or Japan, and they had a lot of power. But what's happened since the 1990s is the rise of this Davos set, for lack of a better term. I'm parroting.
But isn't the Davos set your technocracy? I mean, even Epstein, I'm not.
No, the Davos set are people who have a tremendous amount of wealth and connections of people that they ski with. They're not experts in the data.
You don't ski at Davos. You go and talk to other powerful people.
People ski during the day and then they do that in the evening. I've been to Davos. I don't ski there since my ACL injury, but you would ski. The thing that I'm saying is we need to call out how there is a tremendous injustice with these elites, and therefore not allow neo-populists on the left and right to be the only people talking about that issue. And if we bury our heads in the sand, I think we're going to see more of the rise of Mamdani and Polanski's on the one side, and Farage and Richard Tice and every kind of QAnon nutcase in the States. And in a way, it will be our fault because the media and the mainstream has been burying the real.
So don't they have a point? I mean, no one's defending Epstein as a pedophile, but he was a big defender of science. He invested massively in all sorts of scientific projects. He seemed to believe in science. He was your ultimate rationalist in everything outside the bedroom.
No, I don't think that's fair.
Hold on. What does the Epstein narrative tell us about your defense of order and technocracy, Jason?
I don't think that he was a rationalist. He supported a range of causes that were mutually contradictory so that he could have connections from the Clintons to Woody Allen to Mossad agents to Trump, to also do surveillance deals with African regimes. I believe that those are the things that should be done by government in an ordered society. Private individuals shouldn't have any role in those kind of arms or surveillance deals. That's a result of Reaganite and Thatcherite outsourcing and the decrease of the power of the state. So that's not order. And we should be talking about what the Epstein situation showcases about much of what has gone wrong since the neoliberal reforms of the 80s and 90s.
So what does that mean? So for somebody like Summers, I'm guessing it means, and he's got lots of time to think about this, that you shouldn't become close to men with very dodgy private lives. But what does it mean more broadly for the well-connected, for the powerful? I'm not suggesting that Mark Carney would have become intimate with Epstein, but Carney is exactly the kind of guy that Epstein would have at least tried to fly to his island and invest in and support his causes.
It's not about the sex scandal. That's the point. That's what I'm trying to say. There has been a mainstream media cover-up which is making the Epstein issue about a pedophile ring, because that's salacious and it may sell newspapers, but it covers up from what a real deep dive would show. And because it's not being shown, it leads to, or such is my analysis, a very conspiratorial way of looking at politics. And I don't know if you were, or you or your listeners had heard the interview of Zach Polanski on The Rest is Politics.
Yeah, I did actually. And I thought he was very, very unimpressive and inoffensive, rather boring actually, but that was just
he was puerile, and his understanding of how UK debt servicing works and what
he didn't say anything about Epstein, did he? Polanski?
No, but the reason why we can get political leaders like Mamdani who think that you can fix New York City by freezing the rent and we'll just tax corporations more is because we are creating an environment in which conspiracy theories thrive, Andrew. And conspiracy theories thrive because the mainstream is actually not talking about how a lot of top table political and economic decisions work, which is in smoke-filled rooms and behind closed doors. And we need to advocate for why technocracy works and what is unjust about our current moment. Otherwise, crazy lunatics on the left and the right are going to connect the dots in a potentially very damaging way.
But hasn't the technocracy that you and so nostalgic for, you love so much, hasn't that created all the problems, this increasing inequality, unrest, anxiety, loneliness, everything else?
My argument is that we never had it. I'm not nostalgic for a technocracy. I think there was, no technocracy before. The 1980s represent the absolute partisanification of our politics and the selling off of the crown jewels of state assets. So I'm a left-wing statist in those regards. I'm just conservative socially. What I like about the ordered Cold War period is the sense that the main Western states could work together. I don't envision that they were necessarily technocracies. I think we need to be moving towards a technocracy. And that doesn't mean elites who are in Davos. Those people are there because they have money, not because they've written the critical economic papers about interest rates or inflation. We are moving in a way towards having politics set our inflation and interest rates because Trump is pressuring Jay Powell to do his bidding.
So what you expect then is this Epstein thing next year to blow up even more and for journalists to reveal that Epstein was somehow connected to the Mossad or other American politicians. Is that your big fear?
Correct. I mean, I think it is clear that Epstein was connected to the Mossad. We've known that for quite a few years. But the extent of those connections, and it wasn't that the Mossad was running Epstein. Epstein was far more powerful than just some Mossad agents or the CIA. He was himself an international spy organization or influence operation that connected assets in Russia, Africa, Israel, and the US. And the mainstream media has made this into a sex scandal. And if we continue to ignore it when the Epstein files are released, it's going to come back with a vengeance on the extreme left and right, who can then say, look, we were right. There's been a cover up this whole time. QAnon was right. There is a pedophile ring at the core of our politics. So I think that we've done ourselves a great disservice. And I say we, but I'm not a journalist. I didn't have the ability to do this. But the centrist establishment, New York Times types, they've done themselves a real disservice by mostly dodging the real story.
Finally, I know you've only got 5 minutes left, Jason. You just said you're not a journalist, but you do have a very good podcast, Disorder. You're one of the more popular podcasts when it comes to these issues. What does 2026 promise for Jason Pack? Shouldn't you shut down Disorder if you're not a journalist and focus on reading the Financial Times and the New York Times? If you're such a supporter of order, why be a disorderer in the podcast world?
Well, I think that you are slightly missing what Disorder is about. It's not journalism. It's expert commentary. I have a guest on every week. I don't need to know everything about Iran-US relations because we interviewed Dalia Dasakaya. I don't need to know everything about water resources or rare earths because I have an expert on. We had a Financial Times journalist, Philip Coggan, to tell us about the UK budget. Far be it from me to analyze whether Rachel Reeves did the right things or not. So I would say that that's not journalism. That's just commentary. And what 2026 holds for me, I'm hoping to be working on a popular book. You and I are connected in the literary world by having the same agent. And I hope that that popular book will, get commissioned and move forward. I'm working backgammon articles and a backgammon book and for a new partnership for the Disorder podcast.
Well, I'm not going to make any predictions about 2026, but there'll be more Jason Pack, both on his excellent Disorder podcast. I think this show is going to run on Disorder too and on Keen on America. And we'll have to get you, Jason, As always, back on the show. Happy New Year. Happy, healthy New Year. And we will talk once again in 2026. I hope you're wrong on Epstein, but I fear you may be right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. Always a pleasure, and love the great questions.